Picture, if you will, the grand halls of Tudor England, where shadows dance across stone walls and whispered secrets echo through corridors of power. In these very chambers, a story unfolds that would make even the most seasoned dramatist weep. A tale of two sisters, born of the same tyrannical father, yet destined to walk paths as different as fire and ice. Two sisters, two queens, Mary and Elizabeth, daughters of the most notorious monarch England had ever known. At first glance, these remarkable women seemed as different as night and day. Mary, deeply rooted in the ancient traditions of Catholic faith, was the product of what appeared to be a stable royal marriage. Elizabeth, on the other hand, emerged from the Protestant Reformation her father had violently torn from the very fabric of English society. Between them stood their half-brother Edward, the spoiled prince who would become king at merely 9 years old, the long-awaited male heir their father had sacrificed everything to obtain. But what forces could transform the sacred bond between sisters into a confrontation drenched in tears and blood? Who among them would pay the ultimate price for their father's ruthless ambition? This is not merely a story of royal succession. This is a deeply human tragedy about family, faith, and the devastating cost of power. Henry VIII stands as perhaps history's most brutal monarch, a man so consumed by his need for a male heir that he would behead 2 wives and shatter England's relationship with Rome itself. His obsession with ensuring the survival of the Tudor dynasty planted the very seeds that would grow into tragedy, a toxic relationship between his own flesh and blood that would span decades and cost countless lives. The story begins with young Mary, who for years represented Henry's only hope after endless prayers for an heir went unanswered. Can you imagine the weight of such expectations on a child's shoulders? She was raised with extraordinary care, treated like the precious jewel she was, a true princess in every sense. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was a remarkably learned woman, a Spanish princess who understood the importance of education. Catherine was determined that her daughter would receive the comprehensive education befitting a future monarch, not merely the ornamental learning typically given to noble ladies. This exceptional education shaped Mary profoundly. It instilled in her an unshakable belief that she was every bit as intelligent and capable as any man, a revolutionary concept for a woman of her time. Little did she know that this very confidence would both sustain her through unimaginable trials and contribute to the conflicts that lay ahead. But Mary's charmed childhood was destined to crumble. Her father's obsession with producing a son led him to become completely enamored with Anne Boleyn, a captivating young woman who promised him everything Catherine apparently could not deliver. Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. Why else would he be denied the sons he desperately needed? When Henry demanded that the Pope annul his marriage to Catherine, declaring it invalid from the very beginning, he set in motion events that would tear his family apart. Catherine, with the fierce dignity that had made her such a beloved queen, adamantly refused to simply disappear into a convent. The Pope, caught between political pressures and religious doctrine, disagreed with Henry's demands. And suddenly, young Mary found herself dragged into the center of this devastating war. To force Catherine into submission, Henry employed a cruelty that would shock even by today's standards. He forbade Mary from seeing her beloved mother unless both women recognized his new marriage to Anne Boleyn as legitimate. Imagine for a moment a teenage girl being forced to choose between her principles and her relationship with her mother. This was psychological warfare of the most heinous kind, a heartbreaking, deeply humiliating period that would scar Mary for the rest of her life. During this terrible time, Mary was frequently ill, her body responding to the mental anguish her father inflicted on her. She watched helplessly as Henry attempted to declare her illegitimate, stripping away not just her title, but her very identity. This cruel treatment shaped Mary's character in ways that would echo through history, hardening her resolve while simultaneously breaking something essential within her spirit. The turbulent drama of Henry VIII's court continued to unfold with all the unpredictability of a violent storm. On January 7, 1536, Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, died, still refusing to the very end to recognize Henry's new marriage to Anne. Even in death, Catherine maintained her dignity and her principles, a final act of defiance that must have filled Mary with both pride and devastating grief.
Henry's cruelty toward his eldest daughter did not end even with her mother's death. In what can only be described as an astonishingly heartless act, he refused to allow Mary to attend her own mother's funeral. For a young woman already devastated by loss, this prohibition represented the ultimate cruelty from the man who should have protected and comforted her. For Henry, however, it was simple. He demanded absolute obedience, and anything less was unacceptable. While Mary grieved in isolation, the King and Queen Anne Boleyn actually celebrated Catherine's death at court. But Anne's moment of triumph proved tragically short-lived. Just months later, the wheel of fortune that governed Henry's court spun again, and Anne found herself falling from the king's favor with breathtaking speed. Anne Boleyn was accused of the most serious crimes imaginable: incest, adultery, and treason. Most historians believe these charges were entirely fabricated, manufactured by Henry as a convenient way to rid himself of yet another wife who had failed to provide him with sons. The swift and shocking downfall demonstrated the ephemeral and dangerous nature of power in Henry VIII's court, where today's beloved could become tomorrow's victim with terrifying ease. Anne's primary crime, like Catherine's before her, was her failure to give Henry the male heir he craved above all else. For this perceived failing, she paid with her life, executed on charges that few believed and fewer still dared question publicly. It was around this time that Mary, still grieving her mother's death and witnessing the brutal fate that befell those who crossed her father, finally yielded to the inevitable. Exhausted by years of resistance and terrified of what Henry might do to her if she continued to defy him, Mary made the painful decision to submit. She recognized Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England and, most painfully of all, acknowledged herself as illegitimate. This confession haunted Mary for the rest of her life. She had betrayed everything her mother had stood for, everything she herself had believed, simply to survive. The reward for her sacrifice proved pitilessly small. She was allowed to return to court, but the new act of succession did not restore her position as heir. Instead, it stripped her infant sister Elizabeth of her title and status as well, leaving both sisters in a precarious legal limbo. Then, in the autumn of 1537, everything changed once again. Henry finally received what he had longed for. Through nearly 30 decades of marriage, political upheaval, and personal destruction, a son. Edward's birth filled Henry with a joy that eclipsed everything else in his world. For him, his two daughters suddenly seemed forgotten, no longer important players in the grand drama of royal succession. The entire court now revolved around baby Edward like planets around the sun. Ironically, Edward's birth may have been the best thing that could have happened to both Elizabeth and Mary. With the male heir finally secured, the pressure on both sisters diminished significantly. They now shared the same status as illegitimate children in their father's eyes, and they had a younger brother who represented the future of the Tudor dynasty. Everyone assumed this new reality meant neither sister would ever become queen, a assumption that would prove dramatically wrong. Elizabeth, now free from the intense scrutiny that had surrounded her as the heir presumptive, began receiving a better education. She was later invited to live with Edward, where both children received excellent tutoring that would serve them well in the trials ahead. Mary, too, found herself gradually welcomed back into court life. She was invited more frequently to participate in royal events and slowly began to rebuild her relationship with her father. However, their newfound family harmony came at a terrible cost. Jane Seymour, Edward's mother, died shortly after giving birth, leaving the newborn prince motherless, and Henry once again in search of a wife. 3 more wives would follow in rapid succession, but Henry would have no more children.
For the remainder of their father's life, Mary and Elizabeth shared the same precarious status, officially illegitimate yet undeniably royal, forgotten yet always watched, powerless yet potentially dangerous to those who might seek to control the succession. When Henry VIII died on January 28, 1447, he left behind a complex legacy and an even more complex succession. His will restored both daughters to the line of succession, though they remained officially illegitimate, a contradiction that would create immense difficulties in the years to come. But first in line was their young brother Edward, who ascended to the throne at the tender age of 9. Edward's reign was dominated entirely by regents and manipulative, powerful men who pushed the country in an increasingly Protestant direction. The young king himself became a fervent Protestant, embracing the religious reforms with a zealousness that only youth can possess. This religious transformation created enormous difficulties for both sisters, but especially for Mary. Mary, whose Catholic faith had sustained her through the darkest periods of her life, found herself in constant, intense conflict with her brother's government over religious reforms. She refused to accept the new English prayer book and insisted that her household maintain the traditions of the old religion. The question of whether she could celebrate Catholic Mass in her private home became a source of continuous argument between Mary and the council representing Edward.
The siblings' religious disagreements led to confrontations that were both deeply personal and politically charged. Edward, speaking with the authority of his crown, would declare, "You shall obey me. I am king." Mary, drawing on her years of experience and her position as his elder sister, would reply with equal firmness, "You are my younger brother. I certainly do not take orders from you." These were not mere political disagreements. They were family arguments that cut to the heart of everything both siblings believed. One particularly heartbreaking Christmas Eve is remembered when they stood arguing before the entire court, both weeping over the religious issue that divided them. Mary could not believe in what Edward was doing to their country, while Edward was convinced by Mary's Catholic practices were not just wrong, but dangerous to England's spiritual welfare. Edward VI's reign proved tragically short. In early 1553, the boy king became seriously ill, and it quickly became apparent that his condition was grave. Edward was fully aware that Mary was next in line for the throne, and that she intended to restore Catholicism to England. All the effort he and his advisors had invested in building a Protestant church would be immediately undone if Mary became queen. Faced with this prospect, Edward took drastic action. Because he was too weak to pass an act through Parliament, he wrote what became known as his Devise for the Succession in April 1553, just before his death. This document removed both sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from the line of inheritance entirely, and changed the succession to favor their distant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant who had recently married the son of the powerful regent. Placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne represented nothing less than a Protestant coup designed to prevent Mary from restoring Catholicism. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at just 15 years old. His brief life ended, but his controversial succession plan about to plunge England into crisis. The government kept Edward's death secret for several days while they implemented their succession plan. When news of the king's death finally spread, Mary, from her vast estates in East Anglia, began to gather troops. England stood on the very brink of civil war, with two women claiming the throne and the country forced to choose between them. About 3 days before Edward died, Mary had been traveling to court to visit her brother, believing he had recovered from his illness. She had no idea that it was actually a trap designed to capture her and prevent any resistance to Jane Grey's accession. However, they seriously underestimated Mary's network of supporters and her own political instincts. Mary received a timely warning from a loyal supporter who rode non-stop through the night to reach her with the urgent message, "Don't come to London. There is a plan to arrest you." This warning represented a rare stroke of luck in Mary's eventful and often tragic life. The same supporter also brought her the momentous news that she was now the rightful Queen of England.
Mary immediately turned back towards her strongholds and began mobilizing troops in earnest. East Anglia was an area where Mary had tremendous support, both as Henry VIII's daughter and as a symbol of the old religion many people still secretly preferred. Mary believed with absolute conviction that this was her moment, that God had protected her throughout her life specifically so she could sit on the throne and restore Catholicism to England. This sense of divine mission gave Mary a determination that surprised even her supporters. She was completely prepared to fight for the throne if necessary, displaying the stubborn, obstinate attitude that had always characterized the Tudor lineage. For Mary, this was not just about political power, it was about fulfilling what she saw as her sacred duty. On July 10th, Edward's council, led by the ambitious Duke of Northumberland, formally proclaimed Lady Jane Grey as Queen of England. The council appeared to hold all the advantages. They controlled London, the treasury, and the machinery of government. Northumberland immediately set about gathering forces to arrest both Mary and Elizabeth, confident that swift action would prevent any serious resistance. However, as soon as Northumberland left London with his forces, many of those left behind began to doubt the wisdom and feasibility of the plan. When Lady Jane was proclaimed queen in London, an ominous silence fell over the crowds. It was a strange and unsettling experience for everyone involved. No one cheered for Queen Jane. The people saw her as a usurper, albeit perhaps an unwilling one forced into the role by ambitious men. The English people wanted Henry VIII's daughter as their queen, not some distant cousin imposed upon them by political manipulation. They recognized that Mary, whatever her faults, was the rightful heir who truly deserved to sit on the throne of England. This popular sentiment proved far more powerful than anyone anticipated. In the end, there was no civil war at all. As a frightened Lady Jane Grey waited anxiously in the Tower of London, people across the country spontaneously declared their loyalty to Mary. Even soldiers sent to arrest Mary began defecting to her cause. The Duke of Northumberland himself, after just 6 days of futile pursuit, was forced to face the inevitable and publicly recognize Mary as the rightful queen. Mary's triumph was complete, and she immediately began the journey to London to claim her throne. Her sister Elizabeth found herself in a particularly delicate position during these momentous events. As Mary's heir, she could potentially be either a valuable ally or a dangerous threat, depending on how events unfolded and how Mary chose to view her sister's actions during the succession crisis.
In early August, Elizabeth met her sister outside London in a carefully choreographed display of family unity. Elizabeth arrived with an impressive entourage of 1,000 horsemen dressed in splendid uniforms, a clear declaration of support for Mary, but also a not-so-subtle reminder of Elizabeth's own status and power within the realm. Together, the two sisters rode into London in a magnificent procession that symbolized both Tudor legitimacy and family reconciliation. Mary entered the capital looking completely worthy of her royal position, wearing rich purple robes and resplendent jewelry. She presented herself in the most spectacular way possible, ensuring that everyone who saw her immediately understood that she was unquestionably the center of attention and the rightful queen. Despite lacking natural stage presence and being somewhat awkward and shy in public situations, Mary managed to create a magnificent spectacle. It was a thrilling sight when this rightful queen, who promised to restore unity and peace to a troubled nation, rode into London followed by her tall, ethereally beautiful sister Elizabeth. The visual impact was exactly what Mary intended, a powerful reminder of Tudor legitimacy and family strength. Both Mary and Elizabeth were acutely aware that they were Henry VIII's daughters, and there was a real sense that Tudor legitimacy flowed in their veins like royal blood. This processional was designed as a display of unity, intended to demonstrate the strength and continuity of the Tudor dynasty to both English subjects and foreign observers. But beneath this carefully orchestrated surface, much more complex emotions and calculations were at work. Elizabeth, above all else, was a natural politician who instinctively understood how to navigate dangerous situations. She wanted to maintain political influence for herself and protect her own interests, and she recognized that supporting her sister publicly was the best way to achieve both goals, at least for the moment.
Mary was crowned Queen of England on October 1st, 1553, in a ceremony that clearly announced her intentions for the kingdom's future. It was a thoroughly Catholic ceremony, making it abundantly clear from the very beginning that Mary wanted England to forget its brief experiment as a Protestant nation and return to being a Catholic country in full communion with Rome. When Mary ascended the throne, the Catholic Mass was still technically illegal under the religious laws Edward's government had enacted. Mary Tudor's primary obsession was restoring the Catholic faith to England, and this goal came to dominate her entire political life, her foreign policy, and ultimately her historical legacy. England would become a Catholic nation once again, and everyone would be required to comply with that transformation. Those who refused to comply would face severe punishment. Mary's determination to restore Catholicism led to actions that earned her one of history's most chilling nicknames, Bloody Mary. During her brief reign, she sent hundreds of Protestants to be burned at the stake, creating a reign of terror that traumatized the English people and ensured that her name would forever be associated with religious persecution. What made Mary's reign particularly brutal was not just the number of executions, but the horrific method chosen. In just a few short years, 287 men, women, and children were burned alive for their Protestant beliefs. Mary genuinely believed that executing a few heretics would serve as an effective example to deter others from maintaining their Protestant faith. There was a widespread belief in the 16th century that allowing heretics to live would result in their damnation spreading to others, including those who permitted their survival. Mary felt a profound religious responsibility and obligation to remove these heretics from England, believing she was literally saving souls by destroying bodies. This twisted logic made her persecution feel not just politically necessary, but spiritually essential. For the Catholic faith to be permanently restored in England, Mary understood she needed children to continue her work. To have children, she needed a husband, and her choice astonished her advisors and shocked the entire nation. She decided to marry Prince Philip of Spain, a decision that would prove politically disastrous and personally heartbreaking. Mary faced genuinely difficult choices when selecting a husband. She could not easily marry an English subject without elevating one faction over others and creating dangerous resentments. If she married a foreign prince, however, she would essentially place England under the influence of a foreign power. Mary hoped to create the successful partnership her parents had originally enjoyed, uniting England and Spain in a powerful Catholic alliance. A marriage treaty was carefully drafted stating that Philip would have very limited role in English government, but many English people feared that marriage to Spain would inevitably mean England being absorbed into the Spanish Empire. Poor Mary never fully grasped this fundamental concern. She failed to understand how important it was to her subjects that foreigners should not rule England, and she underestimated the horror many felt at the prospect of submitting to a powerful Catholic foreign nation. Opposition to Mary's Spanish marriage led to the formation of a serious plot to overthrow her and replace her with Elizabeth. Led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, this conspiracy attracted a group of very determined Protestants who gathered between 2,000 and 3,000 people ready to fight against Mary's rule and for Elizabeth's succession.
The rebellion ultimately failed, and its leaders were publicly executed as traitors. While the uprising only briefly threatened Mary's power, its failure created a much more serious and immediate threat to Elizabeth. Many suspected that Elizabeth had been involved in the plot, or at least aware of it, placing her in an extremely awkward and dangerous position. Elizabeth had become the symbol that radical Protestants would inevitably use against Mary's Catholic restoration. She constantly and vehemently protested her innocence when questioned by Mary's Privy Council, but her protests may not have been entirely convincing to her suspicious sister. The most terrifying moment of Elizabeth's life arrived when she was taken to the Tower of London and imprisoned in the same apartments her mother, Anne Boleyn, had occupied before her execution 18 years earlier. Elizabeth was acutely aware that only the thinnest possible margin separated her from suffering a similar fate to her mother. Mary's advisors had actually drafted an execution order for Elizabeth, and historical accounts suggest that Mary very nearly signed it. Her hand was reportedly poised over the document when she suddenly changed her mind. Perhaps she experienced an attack of conscience about executing her own sister. Perhaps she was moved by Elizabeth's desperate letter begging for mercy and forgiveness. Perhaps Mary simply did not want to create further division in a country already torn by religious conflict. Whatever her reasoning, Mary chose to spare Elizabeth's life, though she did imprison her for several months before finally ordering her release. In any case, Mary had more pressing problems demanding her immediate attention than dealing with her potentially troublesome sister. By the end of 1554, Catholic doctrine had reappeared in English churches, and the old anti-heresy laws had returned, once again permitting the trial and execution of Protestants who refused to convert. Also in late 1554, Mary became pregnant, or at least believed herself to be pregnant, a development that filled her with joy and her Protestant subjects with dread. The following spring, Mary summoned Elizabeth to court to witness the birth of the child who would replace Elizabeth in the line of succession and permanently establish England as a Catholic nation. Everything seemed to be proceeding exactly according to Mary's plans, and it represented a moment of profound anxiety for Elizabeth in all English Protestants. However, as so often happened in Mary's life, events did not unfold according to plan. The supposed pregnancy turned out to be what medical historians now recognize as a phantom pregnancy, a psychological condition that can produce many symptoms of genuine pregnancy without an actual child being present. The waiting was prolonged and increasingly embarrassing as everyone at court waited expectantly for the announced due date, but no baby arrived. Eventually, Mary was forced to emerge from her birthing chamber and face the profound humiliation of admitting that she was not actually pregnant after all. The entire nation of England and courts throughout Europe had held their breath waiting for news of the heir whose birth would reshape the balance of religious and political power. Mary's phantom pregnancy was likely caused by ovarian cancer, which would explain the abdominal swelling that had been mistaken for pregnancy and would continue to affect her health for the remainder of her life. Poor Mary found herself both physically suffering and publicly humiliated, while Elizabeth suddenly discovered that she was back in the succession game. The phantom pregnancy changed everything about the political landscape and Mary's personal situation. Mary's Spanish husband, Philip, who had been waiting for the birth of a child who would cement the Spanish alliance, withdrew from England when it became clear there would be no heir. He left the country and returned only briefly for a few months before Mary's death, effectively marking the end of their marriage, a development that caused Mary profound personal pain. It was painfully clear to everyone except Mary herself that Philip did not love her and found her company tedious. Mary, however, had become completely infatuated with her handsome young husband, adoring him with an intensity that made his indifference all the more cruel. When Philip discovered there would be no baby, he was reportedly quite angry and embarrassed, and he returned to Spain as quickly as diplomatic protocols would permit. Thus, Mary was doubly humiliated, failed as a woman, and abandoned as a wife. This personal tragedy coincided with larger political failures that made her reign increasingly ineffective and unpopular. Mary had hoped that a Catholic England would be warmly welcomed back into the embrace of Rome, but instead the country became increasingly isolated on the European stage. The ongoing Habsburg Wars had made Mary's husband Philip an enemy of the Pope himself, shattering Mary's dreams of England united with Rome in perfect Catholic harmony. As Mary approached her 40th birthday, she remained childless and her husband was permanently absent. The future of England seemed decided. It would be the Protestant Elizabeth who would ascend to the throne and undo everything Mary had worked to accomplish. Mary began to decline both physically and mentally during her final years. By mid-1558, her poor health was widely known and discussed throughout the kingdom. Her political judgment appeared to deteriorate, and she seemed increasingly unable to reconcile people with different viewpoints or build the broad consensus that effective rule required.
Mary began to lose control of her government and her kingdom. The English people had never been comfortable with weak, sickly monarchs, viewing such conditions as potential divine judgment upon the nation itself. Because everyone recognized that Mary was dying, people naturally began shifting their allegiance toward Elizabeth as the expected new monarch. Mary could see this political transition happening around her, and it must have been extraordinarily painful to watch. As she herself observed bitterly, people always looked toward the rising sun rather than the setting sun. Courtiers began making pilgrimages to Elizabeth's residence at Hatfield, hoping to curry favor with the woman who would soon be their new queen. Elizabeth, for her part, handled this delicate transition period with remarkable skill, gathering supporters around her while being careful not to appear disloyal to her still living sister. She was already demonstrating the political acumen that would serve her so well in the decades to come. Just 5 years after her triumphant entry into London as the rightful queen, Mary died on November 17, 1558. Elizabeth had been well prepared for this moment, and the transfer of power proved to be the most peaceful England had witnessed in over a century. Elizabeth would go on to reign for 45 years, presiding over what historians would later call the Elizabethan Age, a period of unprecedented English prosperity, cultural achievement, and international influence. The contrast with her sister's brief and troubled reign could hardly have been more dramatic. Yet, despite the volatile relationship between Mary and Elizabeth, a relationship shaped by their father's ruthless ambition, profound religious differences, and the constant struggle for survival in a dangerous political environment, Elizabeth's successful reign actually inherited much from the foundations Mary had established. Important governmental reforms such as financial reorganization and naval development had all been initiated during Mary's reign. Perhaps most significantly, it was Mary who first defined what female sovereignty could look like in England, speaking eloquently of a queen as the mother of her nation, and passing legislation stating that a queen possessed all the powers of a king. Elizabeth benefited enormously from the precedents her sister had established. She wielded power and authority with confidence, partly because Mary had already been there and determined what a queen regnant could and could not do under English law and custom. Both sisters demonstrated conclusively that women could perform the duties of monarchy every bit as effectively as men. They proved themselves equally intelligent, equally capable of political maneuvering, and equally skilled at the complex arts of royal survival. Their father's brutal treatment had forged them in fires that would have destroyed weaker spirits, and they emerged as two of the most fascinating figures in English history. In the end, this tale of two Tudor queens reminds us that even in the most privileged circumstances, family relationships can be complicated, painful, and shaped by forces far beyond individual control. Mary and Elizabeth were sisters who should have been allies, but their father's legacy and their own convictions set them on collision courses that neither could avoid. Their story speaks to something universal in the human experience, the way families can be both sources of strength and wellsprings of conflict, the manner in which love and rivalry can coexist in the same heart, and the tragic reality that sometimes the people who should protect us become the very ones who hurt us most deeply. In the grand tapestry of English history, few threads are as golden or as blood-stained as the bond between these two remarkable sisters who both wore the crown of England, each leaving an indelible mark on the nation they ruled.